Well, thanks everyone for joining. So I work for AppliedOLAP, and just a little bit about myself. So I've worked with Essbase for a while, not as long as some of you on this call, but since about 2005. I've been an Essbase developer. I've been an Essbase consultant, and I do development at a software company that specializes in making Essbase better. So I do a lot of Java work. I've been in the Oracle ACE program. I created a program called DrillBridge, which is for helping make drill through easy from Essbase to relational and other sources. And then sort of notably where I'm spending a big part of my time is on the Dodeca spreadsheet management system, which is the flagship software program from AppliedOLAP. So I like to think of Essbase maybe as the engine, and Dodeca is kind of like everything else you might want to make an actual solution with Essbase. It's the wheels and the frame and the windows and the chairs and like everything else you need for that user experience on top of the engine. So definitely check us out. And not like, I think here on the call, like literally joining the call, but is George Cooper, who's sort of my, technically my partner for this talk. Hi, George. For various reasons, he can't participate in the actual presentation. So I'm going to try and do justice to his content. So that said, this presentation is actually kind of a mix of two presentations. So I submitted an abstract on the Essbase REST API, and George's presentation was more on automation, that happens to involve the new Essbase REST API. And so those presentations got mixed together, or not mixed, but combined. So I'm going to kind of make the case, as you'll see, that maybe automation and the REST API are sort of two pretty distinct things. So this is going to feel kind of like two presentations in one, I think. But hopefully I can kind of lay out, give you a sense of what to use and when, that kind of thing. So just to kind of an overview of where I'm heading. So let's look at some automation options for Essbase. I'm going to give you kind of a crash course on REST APIs in general. I'm going to look specifically at the Essbase REST API using a tool that Oracle's using called Swagger. I'll kind of explain what that is. And then I want to talk about an Essbase REST API client library that we're developing to be an open source project, and how you could, or how people could use that in their own software. And then I'll give you an example with the Groovy programming language, or scripting language, if you will. Okay, so you kind of have these three major automation options with Essbase these days, right? You've got Maxwell, and you've got the Essbase command line, and then you've got this REST API. So we'll kind of do this sort of very high level view of Maxwell. So I think most of us are probably pretty familiar with Maxwell. My understanding is, and I know Mike Larimer, who just went, and other people can do a little more contextual justice to this, but maybe wasn't originally going to be supported in the cloud, but some of the customers rightfully we're like, we've got a lot of stuff we wrote in Maxwell, please can you support it? So the way that Maxwell was sort of originally architected wasn't really conducive to the cloud, especially in terms of security and performance. But what Oracle's done, and the fine folks at the Essbase team, has sort of made a way, found a way to kind of, you make that work, right? Give you kind of a softer migration path, like basically take those scripts and then sort of transparently send them up to the cloud, run them there. So I haven't used this myself, but I think you probably, to my understanding, this is, like I said, this is going to give you a pretty soft migration path for your existing automation, so you don't have to redo all those. Should you use it for new development? Maybe not. As George pointed out to me, who's kind of, he's an Essbase developer, and so he's got this practical knowledge. He says right now it gives us options for which there's no REST API equivalence or equivalence yet. So you might have to use this, which isn't really so bad, right? Now, next up, we have the Essbase command line interface. So this is conceptually similar to the EPM Automate client if you're coming from that sort of EPM world. And it's conceptually similar in the sense that you have a program that is actually using the REST API under the hood, right, to get its job done. But you don't have to worry about REST and JSON and all this stuff. You're just kind of giving it commands like you always did. So now that said, it's not really meant to be just a one-for-one replacement of Maxwell, right? So, and even I have a screenshot here from the Essbase command line documentation. You can get kind of a familiar flavor for what's going on in this program, right? We've got data loads and deploys and dim builds, but then we have some things that they're not in Maxwell, right? We've got LCM export, LCM import, that kind of stuff. So I think starting now, but also in the long run, you're going to see that this tool has a wider functionality set than Maxwell, maybe not deeper, but definitely wider in terms of the things, doing more than just what you could do with Maxwell. I think it's probably fair to say it's poised to receive a lot more development than Maxwell, right? So Maxwell is going to be maybe get some kind of onesie, twosie commands added here and there, but I think for the most part, you're going to see development in this Essbase command line client. And this will grow sort of as the Essbase REST API grows, right? So I have a picture of dog food. So, from in the programming world, we have this expression of like dog fooding, right? So, I put this in here for context, right? Because Oracle is eating their own dog food. And this is kind of a software development expression where it's like, hey, we are consumers of our own product. So if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for everyone else. So I guess the real point here is it's not like the Essbase command line is using some super secret commands that aren't available to everyone else. It literally just sits on top of that REST API. So if you can do it there, with their command line client, then you kind of know that the REST API provides that functionality. So let's talk a little bit more about like the REST API or REST APIs in general. Just by way of kind of a high level overview, REST APIs, we hear this term a lot. Everything's got a REST API. What does that really mean? Well, it works over HTTP. It's the same technology as your web browser. When you go to a website, google.com, amazon.com, whatever, your browser is making a HTTP request to some other server in the world, right? REST APIs work the exact same way. It's making some request with the same basic technology. Now, one of the reasons that REST APIs are so popular is that, well, they're language agnostic. Actually, they're operating system agnostic. Now, what that means is, it kind of in the before time, the old days, if you will, when you wanted to interface with some system, like Essbase, for example, you were dependent on that vendor to provide you with a library to do so. So looking at Essbase over the years, you've had a C API, you've had a Java API, and you've had like a VB API, right? And the C API and the Java APIs still exist, but that kind of boxes you into using those languages that are supported on the platforms they support. And when they release a new version, you're going through this dance of making sure your version matches up perfectly. So this is one of the maybe the main reason that REST APIs or RESTful APIs over HTTP have become so popular is basically it absolves those vendors of having to create those libraries. So like, look, we've got a HTTP library and you can use it from any language you want, right? Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind, this is more for sort of, I guess, context, if not, usefulness. REST APIs are also popular for, they use the same infrastructure as websites, right? So all this technology that really grew so massive over the last 20, 30 years in terms of websites and hosting and performance and reliability, you have load balancers, you have horizontally scaled web servers. So Google has literally hundreds of thousands of different servers around the world, just so they don't have a single point of failure, right? You've got firewalls, you've got DNS. REST APIs basically sit on the same infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of security implications here in terms of how REST APIs work, because it uses different ports than, say, the Essbase Java API or the C API or Essbase itself. So it's easier for companies to kind of, I think, manage the security in a lot of ways because you know what you're getting versus, look at, you look at Essbase in particular, you've got this one main port that it sits on, and then this range of like 1,000 other ports. And that makes a lot of IT departments kind of go, oh, no, you're not opening up all those ports. It's a lot different story with the REST API, where it's like, well, we just need this one port, okay? So just, to kind of, I guess, visually kind of, hit this again with, I think the real thing with the REST API is you can use any language you want, right? Java works, certainly, VB, C++, PHP, Perl, whatever your company uses, Groovy, Python, any OS, Mac OS, Windows, Linux, PowerShell. So I'm not a huge PowerShell user myself, but again, whereas I'm sort of more focused on the REST API side of this, George Cooper has that sort of more practical experience, and they're using PowerShell, right, to automate a lot of their stuff and to wrap those calls to the REST API and control flow and do that kind of stuff. So, I mean, again, I think that's another testament to the flexibility of a REST API, which is use the tooling that you have experience with, that is your enterprise standard or whatever works best for you. So that, again, that's one of the nice things about this. So with a REST API, again, kind of keeping in mind that this is what's sort of being used at the end of the day for, say, the Essbase command line client. You have very granular programmatic control with that API. We'll see a little bit later on in this presentation that everything in a REST API, everything's a resource, and the API itself is used to kind of manage those resources. So everything in a REST API is either a create, like a post or a put, a read operation, meaning, give me the details or give me the contents of this file, or a delete. These are also called the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, like from a relational database. Now most REST APIs, they're basically synonymous with JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. I have a few examples of this I'll show you in a moment. Basically, it's a way of representing data, whether you have objects or lists or arrays. You can also use XML, like that's maybe not as popular, especially given that JSON is supported so well from modern programming languages, but there's nothing stopping you from using, getting that in an XML format. One other thing I'll show you, and I just want to kind of keep you aware of, is there's also this tool called curl. So you'll see a lot of examples in the REST API documentation or on the web, using curl. So I kind of make the case that curl is it's good for testing. Do you want to use it as part of your actual automation? Maybe, I don't know. I'd say I lean towards no, but then again, practically speaking, there's a lot of people that are just, you're going to end up using curl commands in your automation. So so I want to kind of talk about the categories of things that are available in the Essbase REST API. So this is just a partial list I took from the Essbase REST API Swagger documentation. It kind of gives you a sense of the different groups of functionality that exist in this API. So we've got methods or endpoints or services, whatever you want to call it, in the REST API for doing things with or updating, creating, deleting roles and files, aspects of your application configuration, the new data sources and drill through reports, variables, filters. You can execute MDX queries, all this stuff. So this, if you've done anything with Maxwell, with automation or with Essbase, I mean, these things are going to seem familiar to you. Now, one thing that might not seem familiar at first glance is this notion of a job. So as I mentioned, everything in a REST API is a resource, right? And another aspect of REST APIs is that you don't want any individual request to take a long period of time. There's a lot of sort of technical and other reasons that that's a bad thing. So I don't want to necessarily run a calc, and if the calc takes even 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, an hour, whatever, I don't really want to like be waiting on that web request to finish, right? It's going to time out, and then I'm kind of stuck in this weird place, and it just makes troubleshooting really difficult. So in a sort of well-designed REST API, including the Essbase REST API, you have this notion of jobs, right? So if I run the command to kick off a calc script, whether it takes a second or an hour, it's going to create a job. Right now, the job itself is a resource, meaning I can do things to it. I can read it. I can get information about it. Is it running? Did it finish? How long did it take? That kind of thing. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind as you sort of wade through these REST APIs. So again, just to kind of you give some background on the curl program. So this is literally a command line program for making HTTP requests. So basically it's like a web browser that's text-based, right? So when you type in google.com in your web browser, you're making a HTTP GET request to some resource on some server out in the world. That's what curl does. You can do that just from your command line. It's got a ton of options. For creating the exact right HTTP request. You can give it the URL, the verb to use, the payload, meaning like, some arbitrary data. Here's an example hitting the Essbase REST API where I'm saying, hey, I want to add a new script to the sample basic database. And this would be a pretty typical resource path. They're typically organized in a hierarchy. And you can see almost every request here is going to start with /essbase/rest/version1 or v1, and then I'm navigating down this hierarchy. In this case, I have the basic cube or database inside the sample application, and then hanging off that, I have this scripts resource. So again, on curl, definitely use it to facilitate testing. It's usually meant the reason it's typically in documentation is just to show you examples, right? So you can kind of, copy and paste them into your terminal and sort of play with them and see what happens. Again, you can get away with using it in your automation. And I just know for a fact, especially having consulted, people are going to do this. And this is happening today where it's just getting pasted into automation. It works. It does work. I would say, if you're trying to design absolutely 100% robust, lights out automation, it's probably going to work 95 or more % of the time. But the real question is, when something goes wrong, how are you going to handle that, right? Now in Maxwell, you had kind of some limited options for error trapping and airflow. It's pretty common to see Essbase automation scripts where you're like doing a data load, and then how do you know something went wrong? Well, you look for an error file, or maybe you kind of output to a log and you scan that for the word error or warning, that kind of thing. It's kind of the same situation with curl, right? You might be running a command and then you want to check the status code on that or something else. So it'll work. Is it the best thing? I don't know, it depends. All right. I kind of like to joke around. This is from a comedian I saw years ago. He said, is it a good idea? Well, you can technically drive a car with your feet. Doesn't make it a good idea, right? So that's my little analogy for you. So here's an example. This is actually just an example George gave me of how they're using the REST API to upload files. So I apologize for the formatting here, but this is one line, actually. So this is the curl command. Curl doesn't, I don't know about now, but historically hasn't shipped out of the box with Windows. So you had to download this executable. So we're on a command line here calling curl.exe. I have the X parameter saying this is a put type of call as opposed to get or post or delete. And then I have my -h parameter there, which says that's it's a header. Basically, it says, hey, the incoming data is going to be a binary file, right? And like I said, curl has just hundreds of options for very particularly defining requests. So in this case, we're basically telling curl, hey, here's the HTTP header to use, and also I'm going to supply you data from a file, a text file. So I want you to read the data from the file for me, and then do the put request against this URL, right? So here's an example of just putting a file into a staging area and then sending the output of this request just to a file, presumably to do some error checking or review on. So this would be an example. You could run this on your command line. So I think, you'd have to add the, make sure you have the right security headers, I guess, or you're logged in. And this will do that. This will call the REST API and upload that file, right? And then you could log into your instance and see that file, right? So I've already kind of talked about resource URLs. So again, just kind of a different way of looking at the resources that might exist. Again, it's a hierarchy. So you've got your sample. In this case, I'm sort of navigating. This makes it intuitive. I got the sample application. Underneath sample is a resource called databases. Underneath the databases is a resource called basic. So that should seem, that's the sample basic database. And that has scripts and then a particular script, right? So you'll see some examples in a moment where that comes into play. So I want to, what I want to do now is go through kind of an example with the Essbase REST API using Swagger. Now, Swagger is, so it's really cool. So Swagger is not something Oracle made, but it is something they're using, which is really, really smart. It's kind of this, emerged as this standard for documenting REST APIs. So it's really great because you get this super high quality documentation that's pretty consistent. So people that are, developers that are moving from one API to the next, I mean, they're gonna just kind of be able to dive right in, and which is great. So if you have an Essbase server running in the cloud right now, you can access, you have a Swagger instance running, it's not really an instance, it's just a JavaScript page basically, but you can access it, right? So whatever your server is, you can type that in, then hanging off that, you have /Essbase REST doc index.html. You will be required to log in, so you get just a standard login box there. And this might be kind of the home page you see, right? So this is again, this is all totally generic to Swagger. And now at this point, I have all these different groups of functionality I can scroll through, right? So the groups I mentioned earlier, the roles and filters and MDX, like that's what's in this list. That's where I got that list from. So let's say I'm interested in doing something with the applications, right? So I can see, for example, here, I can do a GET request to this particular URL. Now in this case, the URL, you can see it's /applications. So like the full URL would be, yourserver.com/Essbase/REST v1/applications. Now in curly braces, I've got this parameter called application name. So that's where you actually put in the name of that application, right? So you have to supply that. And then after, in this case, sample, I have the database's endpoint, right? So you can kind of scroll through this list and get a real sense of all this stuff available, right? Again, roles, MDX, filters, all that kind of stuff. So if you're doing, if you're going through this process because you need or want to use the REST API, whether it's from curl or from some language, programming language or PowerShell, this might be a pretty common activity where you're just kind of going through the menu here and looking for the thing you want to use, right? In this case, I'm going to do a really simple one. I want a list of databases on that application, right? So if I click on that box to expand it, I'm going to get something like this, right? So now I've got a little more detail on this method. It's that, this is Oracle's documentation now. It's documented such as, returns a list of databases, connection and application are optional. Now, if the user provides a connection, use it, So again, this is all totally standard Swagger at this point, but I've got a try it out button, which is really great because I can literally try out this API directly from this page. So I'll go ahead and click the try it out button. And what's that do? Well, it expands just a list of boxes to prompt me for the input that I need to make to this call, right? So now I can tell from the way this is formatted that the only thing that's required is the application name. So I can go ahead and type in sample and then hit the execute button, the big blue button at the bottom. And now I get this output, okay? So what Swagger has done is it said, oh, here's the call, or here's the command you could make with a curl command line, right? So it kind of wrote that for us, which is nice. So I could take that, copy and paste it to my command line and run that and get the exact same output. Just kind of reminded me of what the URL is. And then it gave me this response body, right? So now I have this information. It might be, this looks a little foreign to you. This is what the JSON format is. So I can kind of, just by kind of eyeballing it, right? We can see I've got a name of an application, or of a cube rather, it's owning application, the owner, one of my colleagues set this up, so it's got his name on it. The creation times are usually expressed in terms of seconds or milliseconds since January 1st, 1970. I can see its status, what type it is, a description, some other stuff like that. So this is a pretty common response or kind of format of a response that you're going to see in a REST API. Now, if I scroll down a little bit more in the way this method is documented, I can see this documentation actually includes a few other types of things that can happen, right? So in the world of HTTP, now if you don't seem to really see it too much these days, but like back in the day, it's a relative term, but everything feels like it was a long time ago, if you know what I mean. But if you went to a website and the page didn't exist, you get a 404 error, right? So if anyone remembers the 404, well, it wasn't found, right? Well, that was your HTTP response code, okay? And we don't really see those when we're browsing the web these days, but they are there under the hood. Now, if everything goes right in a REST API HTTP call, you're going to get a code back, and and that's going to be 200 or in the 200 series, right? So in this case, the documentation is telling me, yeah, you're going to get a 200 code back. Oh, by the way, here's the format of the response you're going to get, right? So I'm going to get this list of items, and you're going to have a name, which is a string, and an owner, which is a string, and a creation times, a number, and so on. Now it's also telling me down here, you might get a 400 code or something in the 400 series, right? So again, not found, 404. Here it's just kind of saying you're going to get a 400 if we failed to get the list of databases. That typically means that there's something wrong with your request, with the client side of it, right? 401, unauthorized, 404, not found, 409, conflict, whatever, right? And it's also telling us we might get a 500 series error. Again, it's a standard HTTP error that usually means something went wrong on the server. The server's offline, couldn't reach this. Like your request was totally formulated correctly. Something happened on our side. Oops, sorry, right? So I just want to kind of talk a little bit more about this JSON format, because if you are going to be dealing with these APIs with whether it's in PowerShell or curl or whatever, you're going to kind of be forced to confront this whole JSON thing, right? So just by way of a really brief crash course, this format means you kind of have this arbitrary level of complexity you can achieve, right? So this opening curly brace means this is all one object. So this is a typical, most JSON responses are just going to be an object, right? The whole response itself is one object. Now within that object, I've got a key named items, and this rectangular bracket or this normal bracket tells me this is now an array, right? Or a list of things. And this makes sense because if I want the list of databases, I'm going to get a list of databases. And in this case, you're getting a list of objects back. And this is just one item in the list right now, but you have basic and then the associated properties you see there. So now if you're going to go down this road of automating, whether it's with curl or PowerShell, you're going to need a way to parse these, right? And you probably don't want to be doing, if you find yourself doing things where you're kind of scanning for lines and trying to break this response up into lines and then maybe drop the quotes and split it based on a colon, you're doing something wrong. Like that's not quite really what you want to do. There's some other tools that can help you with that. Here's just another example, just formatted a little bit differently. So I could do a curl request to my server using the get method now. And then to this path, applications, sample, databases, basic scripts. So this will give me the list of scripts on that cube, right? So just a kind of another view of things here. And in that case, I'm going to get a response like this, right? Again, it's all one object. That's my curly brace up here. And then it's pretty common to see, this key named items. And now I've got a list here. So in this case, if I get the list of scripts, everything's got a name, everything's got a modified time, which again is like basically a date. And then I've got a size in bytes, right? 1 second. Well, and so you can represent pretty much infinitely complex data with JSON. It's conceptually the same as XML, just a little less verbose. You'll find that JSON, most programming languages have pretty strong support for parsing this now. So if you are in something a little bit lower level, like PowerShell or the command line, again, try not to like, parse that output yourself. If you have to, there's a tool called JQ or like JSON query or something along those lines. That's another command line tool that you can actually feed JSON into, and this will parse it for you. So again, if you really have to just do this on the command line, get a tool like this or something similar that'll actually properly parse that response for you, so you're not kind of leaning on some fuzzy logic. So now I want to kind of go to sort of yet another distinct portion of this talk. So again, I mentioned this talk's or presentation is kind of a combination of a few different things. So we've covered at a high level, ways to automate, and then how you can kind of navigate through either with the Essbase command line client, which is new, or go directly to the Essbase REST API. So now this is kind of like, I guess, my part of the talk where I would talk about, okay, well, let's make an actual library to consume this REST API. So one of the things that that I created years ago was a very similar Java library that's an open source project that consumes or works with the PBCS REST API. So PBCS has its own similar in concept REST API to the Essbase REST API, and all the stuff I mentioned kind of applies, right? Where you don't really want to be issuing curl commands. Over on the PBCS side of the world, you've got, or in that associated tools in that ecosystem, you've got the EPM automate tool. So that's kind of that analog or predecessor even to the Essbase command line client, which again, it's consuming the REST API, and you can do some automation with it. Now, you're going to want like if you're going to do programming or development, so maybe not so much automation, but integration in a programming language, you're going to want to use a library, okay, not just making calls to curl. So for example, in with the Applied Labs Drawbridge tool, it provides drill through from PBCS to relational databases, right? And your Drawbridge can provide upper level drill through from PBCS, right? So if you drill on quarter one from PBCS to Drawbridge, you can get, you can drill, basically the equivalent of January, February, March, that kind of thing, those lower level intersections. How does Drawbridge accomplish that? It uses the PBCS REST API via the open source PBCS REST API Java library. Okay, so it's very nice to have a library that just handles all the junk with JSON and HTTP for you. So similar to that effort, we are working on a Java library that consumes the Essbase REST API, and it's modeled on the traditional Essbase Java API. So it should feel familiar, right? And it's what we call a domain-specific language. So again, it just kind of lets you not have to worry about all this stuff going on under the hood. You just get to kind of get down to business, right? So the plan is to make this an open source project that anyone can kind of use or leverage or even contribute to. I don't have any date on that yet, but if you want to help test it, just send me an email, please. So just by way of example, so again, we kind of looked at what some curl and Essbase command line examples might look like for, say, getting a list of databases on an application. This is the entirety of a program for running a calculation. So if you use this library, and this is just Java code right here, this is all you need to write. Okay, so I'm saying I want to create a new client object. Here's the server, here's the username, here's the password, and then I just want to get this application named sample, and then I want to run a calculation named calcall. So that's all you need to write. So again, it's no JSON, no HTTP, none of that stuff. So that's kind of the point of developing. Well, it's kind of one of the points of, say, Oracle creating a REST API, and then someone else, Oracle or otherwise, in this case us, developing a library that sits on top of that. I guess I have a weird animation here, but you need to get that cube object and then run the calculation using that cube. So you might be thinking, well, how does this compare to the classic Java API? Well, there's a few differences, right? If you want to, we're using the Java API very extensively, so that's nice that Java API is fully supported on Essbase Cloud. And that said, the new functionality, kind of as with like the Essbase command line client getting new stuff that the Maxwell client won't, the new stuff and some of the interesting stuff is going to go into the Essbase REST API, not necessarily the Java API. Like think of the cube designer stuff where it's taking that spreadsheet and creating a cube from that. So we also tend to see that a REST API will more gracefully handle API changes. So that means that properties can get added. That doesn't break existing stuff. That can really wreak havoc over on like a traditional DLL or Java library type of use case, because like the binary format changes a little bit and just breaks everything. And that's why we go out of our way to marry up those versions so precisely. But not so with the REST API. You can, like I said, you can add new commands, and existing clients don't really care. They're like, it's there, but it doesn't hurt anything. So I would say that the REST API in some ways already is preferable to using the Java API, but in some ways it's not, right? So I think this API will probably eventually, well, I don't know if I could say it will displace the Java API, but it'll definitely probably become, I'd guess it's going to become more popular, okay? So if we look at, so if you ever kind of slogged through the, like the Java doc for the Essbase Java API, these things might feel familiar. These are actually objects in this library that we're working on, where we've got all these different sort of models for interacting with different objects, right? We've got Essbase applications and clients and cubes and sessions and variables and that kind of stuff. So if you're doing any kind of, if you've done any development, this will all feel pretty familiar to you. And this is just kind of a copy and paste of some of the methods from the Essbase client object, right? So you can just see like, fourth from the bottom here, I've got literally a method built in that calls that functionality for building a queue from an Excel spreadsheet. So that's just not available in the Java API. So I just provided an import definition and, kind of on my way. So I just wanted to give kind of a flavor or an example of the things that are in that API. So lastly, to kind of round this out, Groovy is pretty popular. So I know from, I guess, experience, there's kind of this like pretty wide gap between, I guess, Java developers and then the finance people that are typically like what I see as, the developers and administrators of Essbase. So like Java has a lot of, boilerplate and ceremony, if you will. So they can be a little intimidating, right? Because now you have to get an editor and you have to build this class and how does this work with the jar files and all that kind of stuff. So it might be a bridge too far for a lot of people. And honestly, I wouldn't, if you can avoid it, I mean, the point I want to make in this presentation is don't use Java for automation. It's really not, that's really not the point of either this library or the REST API, or although you could, right, if you really had to. That said, something that lowers the barriers to entry for creating functionality that consumes the REST API is Groovy, right? So Groovy is a pretty popular language that Oracle seems to be kind of all in on, whether it's inside of their EPM apps or just as a command line scripting tool. One thing to note about Groovy, it runs in the JVM. So Java code runs on something called the Java virtual machine. And there's actually a handful of languages that run on the JVM. And what that means is that if you have a Java library, in this case, the Essbase REST API Java library, you can use that with any language that runs on the JVM, right? So we've got Java, we've got Groovy. We actually have a handful of other things. So this top row here are probably the more popular ones, right? Java and Groovy. Also Jython, which is basically Python, the Python programming language running on a JVM, as well as these others on the bottom, Ruby, Scala, and Kotlin. And I think looking forward, Groovy is definitely probably poised for the most popularity in the Oracle ecosystem, but I'll be curious to see what happens with Python. It's used so heavily in data science. So to be able to kind of merge the worlds of data science and Python, I think is really interesting, right? So the point is, any of these languages can be used to leverage this library and do automation or integration. So I want to take kind of that example from before where I'm just setting up a new client and do a Groovy example, right? So this is literally an entire program. This is a Groovy script. Now this Groovy script is referencing a jar file, a Java jar file, meaning the Java Essbase REST API library, such as it exists today, and now gets to just natively use that functionality. So I'm basically saying, okay, I want a new client object, right? Here's a server, here's a username, here's a password. And then on that client object, I want to get an application. And on that application, I want to get this cube. And then on that cube, I want to run this calculation script. So you can run this right now, and this will run that calc script. Now that's completely exactly going to end up with the exact same result as if you use, say, the Essbase command line interface to do the same thing, right? So on that Oracle provided tool, which again is using the REST API, as is the Groovy example I just showed you by way of the Java library, the exact same thing happens here, right? So SCS, calc, V for verbose, here's the app sample, here's the database basic, and then here's the script name calc all. So exact same result. So that's one of the great things about a REST API, right? So just to kind of offer you, recap, again, I said it at the beginning, this presentation really is almost like an odd combination of two things, because we do mention REST API in, at least in terms of Essbase and even EPM, automation and the REST API are kind of synonymous and mentioned in the same breath, but I think I would make the case that maybe they shouldn't be, right? So for your automation, you've got Maxwell, you've got this command line client, those work fine. You can use the REST API, and as I know is happening already, including some of the examples, George showed with me what they're doing today. Sometimes you just have to call the REST API. So I would make the case that if you just absolutely have to do a curl call in your automation file to call the REST API, go for it. But I think if you can at all refactor that into the Essbase command line client, especially as they're adding more commands over time, do that. Now over on the programming, in terms of the programming side of the house for integration, like maybe making our Drillbridge and Dodeca products interface with Essbase Cloud, yeah, we're going to continue to use the Java API, but at some point in the future, we're going to also support the REST API, which opens up some interesting integration possibilities for us. So I guess I would just say that keep in mind there's kind of a difference here between automating and programming. So when should you use what? Well, that's the whole classic it depends thing, right? So all of these options have sort of different trade-offs in terms of their performance, but also their complexity, their flexibility, or their readability, their maintainability, and their robustness. So I think that if you start going down that road where you're using just raw REST API calls in your automation, I think that's going to get a little tricky to manage robustness, but as well as just the readability of that code. So again, I think that's another reason to use that Essbase command line client, or something that's just a little less verbose. So, I mean, like I said, as always, it depends. So kind of, you're going to use what works for you. But I think the REST API is a really exciting development in the Essbase ecosystem. So with that, that's my presentation. So I don't know if we have any questions or answers, people probably aren't submitting answers. I'm happy to take questions, time permitting here.
Thank you, Jason. I don't really see any questions in the chat.
Right.
Can you see those on your end? I mean, there's comments, but, oh, well, actually, there are some questions. Can you see those?
Yeah, I can now. So, mostly from George providing answers. So George, great. All right, thank you, George. Appreciate it. Sorry you couldn't attend and provide kind of your sort of from the trenches practical experience, but maybe next time we'll be able to coordinate. All right. All right, cool.
You good?
Well, actually, there's one question here. Sorry, I didn't see it. Let's see here. Some joker named Tim Toe had a question. So can you compare the performance between the REST API and the Java API? More to come on that. I mean, I think for the most part, you have to keep in mind this, right? So those REST API calls that we can make to the Essbase REST API, they are, for the most part, using the Essbase Java API under the hood, right? So all else being equal, like now you've kind of introduced this additional layer of indirection, or that's going to take some amount of performance out, right? So if you want the absolute fastest in the world, you probably want to go with the Java API. I think in the long run, one of the goals for the REST API is that you'll be able to more aggressively cache operations and use your load balancers and things like that. So I don't know that there's practical differences yet, but it depends. And in the case of like building the cube from the Excel spreadsheet, you just can't do that with the Java API, right? Question from Andre. What IDE for Groovy development? That example I showed was IntelliJ IDEA, which has support for Groovy. I don't do a lot of Groovy development myself, but just from even just putting the examples together, I was pretty happy with IntelliJ, which had the syntax highlighting and then the ability just to kind of easily add in that Java jar file, and just kind of worked. So I was really impressed with what I saw from that so far. So definitely use an IDE when you can, instead of Notepad or Notepad++ or that kind of thing. It's just going to make it, it's going to be harder, especially for people without a traditional programming background. It's going to be a little harder and more intimidating to get going with a full-blown IDE, but I strongly encourage you to hang in there, because it'll pay off huge dividends, right? In the long run, where it's just doing a lot of the work for you of getting those files running and all that kind of stuff. Yep, you're welcome. And then yeah, so another thing, so George wanted me to point out another thing they're doing using the REST API and then PowerShell on top of it is it made their automation a lot easier. So like uploads and moves with wildcards and recursive uploads and downloads for entire hierarchies and things like that. So that was one of the big things sort of George impressed upon me, was just the ability to upload files, especially using that API, was a lot more performant for them, so that they could then run the data loads and things like that. So yeah, I think I completely agree in that regard. Now, ideally, that Essbase CS or the Essbase CLI would, evolve to include those kind of switches, right? Where you could say upload this whole folder, and it's just one less thing you have to write. But I think, as we all know, sometimes you just have to get it done with what you have at a given point in time. So, all right, and that's all the questions. So thanks all. If anyone has anything else for me, if you have a question, feel free to email me. And thanks for attending.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason.